Somewhere in Washington, D.C., sits a windowless room with a single question hanging over it. If you melted down every ounce of gold ever pulled out of the ground in the entire history of the human species, how big would that pile actually be? Not a metaphor. An actual physical object you could stand next to. The answer surprises almost everyone who hears it for the first time, and I promise we'll get to it. But here's the more interesting question sitting underneath that one, the one this entire video is really about. Why, in the year 2026, with all of our spreadsheets and algorithms and instant digital payments, our national governments, including some of the most powerful economies on Earth, quietly buying up as much of that pile as they can get their hands on? Central banks bought gold at a pace in the past few years that hasn't been seen in generations. Russia's been stacking it. China's been stacking it. And in the United States, individual states have started passing laws to make gold spendable again, like actual currency, for the first time in nearly a century. Something is happening. And it isn't nostalgia. To understand why the most sophisticated financial system in human history keeps crawling back to a shiny rock, you have to go back to before money existed at all. Because gold's story was never really about gold. It was about something far stranger. The moment human beings collectively agreed to believe in something that has no practical use whatsoever, and built the entire modern world on top of that belief. Every ounce of gold anyone has ever held, worn, or fought a war over arrived on this planet the same violent way, riding inside an asteroid. Here's the science, and it's stranger than most people realize. Gold doesn't form the way most elements on Earth do. It's forged inside the collapsing cores of dying stars, the kind of cataclysmic stellar explosions that scatter heavy elements across the universe like debris from a demolition. Some of that debris, billions of years ago, slammed into a young, molten Earth, seeding the planet's crust with veins of gold that sat buried and undiscovered for eons. Rivers eventually cut through mountains, exposing flecks of it in the streambeds, and at some point, tens of thousands of years ago, a human being crouched down at the edge of one of those rivers and noticed something odd glinting in the current. What that person noticed, without any understanding of physics, was something genuinely unusual at the atomic level. Gold's electrons move at speeds close to the speed of light, fast enough that the metal absorbs blue light and reflects back yellow and red, which is the actual physical reason gold looks the way it looks. No other common metal does this. It doesn't tarnish. It doesn't rust. You can bury it in mud for 1,000 years and pull it out looking exactly the way it went in. To early humans with no concept of electron behavior, this must have looked almost supernatural, a metal that time itself couldn't touch. And so, independently, in civilizations that had no contact with one another, the same instinct kept repeating itself. In ancient Egypt, gold was reserved for pharaohs and the gods they claimed descent from. Death masks, coffins, temple ornaments built to last into eternity, because gold looked eternal. In the Andes, the Inca called it the sweat of the sun and covered their temples in it. Chinese emperors, convinced of its incorruptibility, actually ingested powdered gold in the hope it would make them immortal. It didn't, and in some cases, likely poisoned them slowly instead. Solomon plated his temple in it. Greek sculptors shaped it into likenesses of their gods. Long before anyone used gold to buy anything, human beings had already decided, independently, on every populated continent, that this particular metal meant something. But meaning something to gods and kings isn't the same as becoming money. And this is where the story takes its first genuinely strange turn, the one that everything else in this video depends on. Because for most of early human history, The actual technology of trade wasn't gold. It was livestock. Cattle were, in the most literal sense, the original currency for a huge swath of the ancient world. They made a kind of brutal, practical sense. You needed cows for food and labor already, so cattle held obvious, universal value. They could transport themselves, literally walk to market. They were relatively easy to maintain, since they mostly fed themselves on grass. If you wanted to buy grain from a neighboring village, you didn't need to invent an abstract financial instrument. You just needed a cow they wanted as badly as you wanted their grain. The problem, of course, is that cows make catastrophically bad money once a society gets remotely sophisticated. They spoil. They get sick and die, taking your entire savings account down with them. They're nearly impossible to divide into small, precise units. You can't hand someone 1/5 of a cow for a fair trade and expect the transaction to end well for the cow. And moving cattle any real distance, especially across mountains or by sea, is slow, risky, and expensive. So human beings, across wildly different cultures with no contact with each other, arrived independently at the same practical solution. Find something valuable that doesn't have any of those drawbacks. Something you could carry across a continent in a small pouch instead of herding across it on foot. Something you could melt down and divide into exact, verifiable, tiny units instead of watching it die of disease. And ideally, something that already carried the kind of reverence and desirability gold had been accumulating in human minds for thousands of years already. Gold checked almost every box on that list: durable, portable, divisible, universally recognized as desirable across cultures that had never even met each other. There was just one catch. And it's the catch this entire video is really built around. Gold doesn't actually do anything. You can't eat it, burn it for warmth, or build shelter out of it in any practical sense. Unlike a cow, gold has almost zero intrinsic biological utility to a human being trying to survive. Which means that for gold to become money, for a shiny, useless metal to somehow become the foundation of entire economies for the next 5,000 years, humanity needed to introduce something far more powerful than any physical property gold actually possesses. Not chemistry, not scarcity, though that mattered too. What gold needed, more than anything else, was for enough people, in enough places, to simply agree to believe in it at the same time. That single collective decision, the moment belief turned a decorative metal into a functioning economic system, is the real hinge this entire story turns on. And once you understand how fragile and how powerful that kind of belief actually is, you start to see why nations are scrambling back toward gold again in 2026, nearly a century after the world was told it didn't need it anymore. Belief, once it takes hold of enough people at once, has a strange kind of gravity. It starts as a shared idea, and it ends up reshaping continents. By the time gold's reputation had spread across enough of the ancient trading world, through the Mediterranean, across the Silk Road, into the courts of Europe, it had become something more than decoration. It had become a near universal medium of exchange, stamped into standardized coins, weighed, measured, and trusted across cultures that otherwise shared almost nothing in common. Silver rode alongside it, playing a supporting role as the more common, less prestigious cousin. Together, for the better part of 2,000 years, the two metals quietly underwrote nearly every major economy on Earth. But belief that powerful eventually curdles into something more dangerous, and nowhere is that clearer than in the story of what happened when European ambition collided with a civilization that had never assigned gold the same economic meaning at all. In 1519, Spanish conquistadors landed on the shores of what is now Mexico and encountered the Aztec Empire, a civilization that used gold constantly, but never as currency. To the Aztecs, gold decorated temples, adorned rulers, and honored gods. It had spiritual and aesthetic weight, not economic weight. It wasn't wealth in the sense the Spanish understood wealth. It was closer to sacred material, beautiful, ceremonial, and, crucially, not something they were hoarding or trading the way Europeans traded currency. The Spanish saw something entirely different. One conquistador, describing the fever that gripped his fellow soldiers, wrote that they suffered from, in his words, a sickness of the heart that only gold could cure. What followed was not a trade negotiation. It was conquest, disease, and the systematic destruction of an entire civilization's material culture. Sacred objects, ceremonial art, centuries of craftsmanship melted down indiscriminately into featureless bars and stamped with the seal of a foreign crown. The gold itself didn't change. What changed was the belief system stamped onto it. From sacred object to fungible currency, from meaning to money, in the span of a single violent decade. That transformation didn't stay contained to Mexico. It ignited what became a continent-spanning obsession. Over the following century, European empires tore through the Americas, chasing rumors of golden cities that, in most cases, never actually existed. El Dorado, Cibola, places built more out of desperate imagination than any actual geography. Ordinary people caught the same fever generations later, in waves that reshaped entire regions of the modern world, almost by accident. In 1849, tens of thousands of prospectors flooded into California chasing gold, laying the groundwork for a state that would eventually become one of the largest economies on the planet. An outcome nobody was thinking about while they were kneeling in freezing rivers panning for flecks of metal. The same fever swept through Canada's Yukon, through South Africa, through the interior of Australia and the Amazon. Different continents, different decades, the same underlying psychology. Entire populations willing to migrate, suffer, and sometimes die, chasing a metal that, on a purely biological level, could do absolutely nothing to keep them alive. By the 1800s, this psychological transformation was essentially complete. Gold wasn't just valuable in scattered pockets of the world anymore. It had become the closest thing humanity had to a genuinely universal store of value, recognized and trusted across nearly every major economy on Earth, regardless of language, religion, or political system. And that near-universal trust set the stage for the next major leap in this story, one that would take gold from something you carry in your pocket to something you barely ever see at all. Because carrying enormous quantities of physical gold around, it turned out, was a serious logistical problem. Heavy, dangerous to transport, difficult to secure. And humanity, ever resourceful when there's friction to eliminate, came up with an elegant solution. What if, instead of carrying the gold itself, you simply carried a piece of paper that promised the gold was waiting for you somewhere safe? That single idea, trusting a piece of paper instead of the metal itself, would go on to build and very nearly destroy the modern global economy. It worked something like this. You'd deposit your gold with a bank, and in exchange, the bank would hand you a note, essentially an IOU, a promise printed on paper stating that a specific amount of gold was sitting in their vault with your name on it, redeemable whenever you wanted it back. For most of American history, this wasn't abstract. One $20 bill represented, quite literally, 1 ounce of gold sitting in a vault somewhere, waiting for you. Workers got paid in these notes. Businesses transacted in them. Nobody thought twice about which specific bank had issued the paper in their wallet, because all of it, in theory, was interchangeable, each note as good as the gold it represented. This was already a significant psychological leap from where the story started. We'd gone from cattle, something that could directly keep you alive, to gold, something with no survival value but immense collective belief behind it, and now to paper, something with no inherent value at all, backed only by trust in an institution's promise to redeem it for the thing that actually had collective belief behind it. Layers of abstraction, stacking on top of each other, each one only holding up because enough people kept believing in the layer beneath it. And for a while, it worked beautifully. It made trade dramatically easier. It let economies grow faster than gold alone could have physically supported. But it also introduced a new and fundamentally human kind of risk, one that had nothing to do with gold's chemistry and everything to do with psychology. Because if enough people ever stopped trusting that the gold was actually there, they would all try to redeem their paper for the real thing at the same time. And when that happened, the whole elegant system would seize up almost instantly. That's precisely what started happening with unsettling regularity in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Waves of financial panic that sent crowds of anxious depositors rushing to banks, demanding their gold and silver coins back before they feared someone else got there first. Each individual bank only kept a fraction of its deposits on hand at any given time, which made perfect sense in calm conditions and turned catastrophic the moment fear took over. A rumor could empty a bank's vault in hours, and when one bank collapsed, the fear had a habit of spreading to the next one, and the one after that. By 1913, American policymakers had concluded that a patchwork of thousands of individual banks, each managing its own gold reserves and its own crises, was simply too fragile to keep supporting a modern industrial economy. Their solution was to create a single, centralized institution with the authority to manage the entire system's money supply and stand behind it in moments of panic. The Federal Reserve, the Fed, as it's known today. The dollar remained technically pegged to gold. $20 still meant 1 ounce on paper. But now there was a new institution sitting between ordinary Americans and their gold, one with genuinely enormous, largely invisible power over how much money moved through the economy at any given moment. Power exercised through interest rates, lending policy, and a set of financial levers most citizens would never fully understand or even notice being pulled. That power got tested almost immediately, and not gently. Throughout the 1920s, looser lending conditions helped fuel one of the most explosive economic booms in American history. Stock prices roughly quadrupling in under a decade, fortunes made seemingly overnight, an entire culture convinced the good times had become permanent. Economists still argue, a century later, about exactly how much the Fed's own policies inflated that bubble beyond what genuine industrial innovation, like electrification and mass automobile production, could naturally support. What almost nobody disputes is what happened next. The bubble burst catastrophically in 1929, and the United States, along with most of the industrialized world, spiraled into the Great Depression. And here is where the story reaches its most consequential turning point. The moment where the gold standard itself, the very system built to keep money honest and stable, became the thing actively making the crisis worse. During the depths of the Great Depression, the Federal Reserve had a tool sitting right in front of it that, in theory, could have eased the suffering dramatically. Lower interest rates, make borrowing cheaper, push more money into a starving economy, and give businesses and families room to breathe. Nearly every economist studying the crisis, then and now, agrees this was the correct medicine. The Fed barely used it. And the reason why reveals something uncomfortable about what happens when a monetary system built on scarcity collides with a genuine emergency. Because the entire currency supply was still pegged to a finite physical quantity of gold sitting in vaults, the Fed's freedom to act was fundamentally constrained. If they printed more dollars or lowered rates aggressively, they risked a scenario where panicked citizens and foreign governments alike would rush to redeem their paper for actual gold. And if that gold reserve ran dry, the entire currency system could collapse overnight. So instead of loosening the system to help a suffering population, the Fed did the opposite. It raised interest rates in the middle of an economic catastrophe, prioritizing the defense of its gold reserves over the immediate needs of tens of millions of unemployed Americans. Bank runs intensified. Families pulled gold and silver coins out of failing banks and hid them under mattresses, pulling even more currency out of an already starving economy. What could have been a severe recession stretched instead into nearly a decade of grinding, generational hardship. By 1933, the new administration under President Franklin Roosevelt reached an extraordinary conclusion. The gold standard itself, the system designed to keep money trustworthy and stable, had become a straitjacket actively preventing the government from responding to a national emergency. In one of the more dramatic monetary decisions in American history, Roosevelt issued an executive order requiring ordinary American citizens to turn in their privately held gold in exchange for paper currency, formally severing the direct individual link between the dollar and the metal that had defined it for over a century. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it's the single largest psychological leap in this entire story. Money was still, as it had always been, fundamentally an act of collective belief. But the object of that belief had just shifted from something physical and finite, a metal you could hold, weigh, and bite to test its purity, to something almost entirely abstract: trust in a government's promise to manage an unlimited, printable currency responsibly. This is what economists call fiat money, currency with value, not because it's backed by a scarce physical commodity, but simply because a government declares it legal tender. And enough people continue believing that declaration means something. It's a genuinely controversial shift, and it remains one within economics to this day. Supporters argue that fiat currency, managed properly, gives a government the flexibility to respond to genuine crises, the gold standard made nearly impossible, pointing to relatively fast recoveries from both the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic as evidence that flexible monetary policy, freed from the constraints of physical gold reserves, can actually work. Critics argue the opposite, that removing the hard discipline gold once imposed gave central banks essentially unlimited room to make mistakes without consequence, and that persistent inflation over the following decades is the direct ongoing cost of a currency no longer anchored to anything physically scarce. Serious credentialed economists land on genuinely different sides of this debate, and this video isn't going to pretend there's a tidy consensus where none actually exists. But here's the twist that most people, even those who know this history reasonably well, tend to forget. Severing the dollar from gold domestically in 1933 didn't actually mean gold disappeared from the story of money. It simply moved to a different stage, from your wallet to the vaults of nations. And just over a decade later, in the shattered aftermath of the deadliest war in human history, gold would find its way back to the absolute center of the entire global financial system in a way that would shape the fate of the world economy for the next 30 years. In 1944, with the Second World War still grinding toward its final months, delegates from dozens of allied nations gathered at a mountain resort in New Hampshire with an almost impossibly large task in front of them: design the financial architecture for whatever world would exist once the fighting finally stopped. The United States arrived at that meeting in an extraordinary position. It had emerged from the war as, by a wide margin, the most powerful economy on Earth, its industrial base untouched by the bombing that had devastated Europe and much of Asia. And crucially, it was sitting on the largest gold reserve any nation had ever assembled. Much of it accumulated because Allied nations had spent years paying for American weapons, ships, and supplies in the one currency everyone still trusted absolutely. Rather than proposing some entirely new neutral global currency, American negotiators made a different kind of offer, one that was as much a demonstration of confidence as it was a financial proposal. Let the US dollar become the anchor of the entire global monetary system, they argued. Every other nation's currency would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself would remain directly convertible into gold at a fixed rate, $35 per ounce, available to any foreign government that wanted to redeem it. It was, in effect, America asking the rest of the world to trust its promise, the same way individual American citizens had once trusted their local bank's promise decades earlier. The other nations, without many better alternatives on the table, agreed. The Bretton Woods system was born, and the dollar became, almost overnight, the reserve currency of the entire planet. For a while, this arrangement worked exactly as designed. But a structural problem was quietly building underneath the surface, one baked into the deal from the very beginning. As the American economy expanded through the 1950s and 60s, fueling Reconstruction efforts abroad, funding an expensive and increasingly unpopular war in Vietnam, sustaining a growing domestic welfare state, the United States kept printing and distributing more dollars into the global economy than its actual physical gold reserves could realistically back. For years, most nations chose not to test that gap directly, largely out of a kind of diplomatic courtesy, or perhaps a reluctance to be the one to publicly question American solvency. France was not interested in extending that courtesy. By the late 1960s, the French government began systematically redeeming its dollar reserves for physical gold, reportedly at one point sending naval vessels to New York specifically to collect it, a pointed, almost theatrical demonstration of exactly how seriously other nations were beginning to take the widening gap between American promises and American gold reserves. Other countries, watching France's move, began quietly doing the same, and the pressure on America's gold stockpile intensified rapidly. By August 1971, the pressure had become unsustainable. President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and announced what historians now refer to as the Nixon shock. The United States was suspending the dollar's convertibility into gold entirely, effective immediately, with no announced plan to restore it. The message to the rest of the world was, in substance, exactly what Franklin Roosevelt had told American citizens back in 1933. The promise you were relying on no longer physically exists, but please continue trusting the system anyway. This time, the rest of the world had far less choice in the matter than individual Americans once had. By 1971, the global economy had become so thoroughly built around the dollar that unwinding it wasn't a realistic option for anyone. The world, largely by necessity rather than enthusiasm, kept using it. And with that single announcement, the story of modern money completed its strangest transformation yet. For the first time in human history, the entire global financial system was operating on pure fiat currency, value derived from nothing except collective belief in governments and central banks, with no physical commodity anchoring any of it, anywhere, for anyone. Gold hadn't disappeared. It had simply been quietly retired from its active role, sitting in vaults from Fort Knox to a heavily secured facility buried 50 feet beneath the bedrock of Manhattan, no longer circulating, but never actually given away either. which brings the story fully back to where it started, and to the question sitting underneath everything happening right now in 2026. Because that retired, dormant metal is suddenly active again, and the reason has almost nothing to do with gold itself, and almost everything to do with a familiar, uncomfortable question resurfacing across the world's central banks. How much do we still actually trust the promise we all agreed to believe in back in 1971? If you've made it this far with me, thank you, genuinely. This is exactly the kind of story I built this channel to tell. Not the 5-minute headline version, but the slower one, where you actually understand the machinery underneath the news. If that's what you're after, consider subscribing and joining us. We do this every single day. All right, back to it. Because I imagine some of you are already forming a version of the same question. If fiat currency has worked reasonably well for over 50 years now, why exactly are so many governments quietly moving back toward gold right now, in this specific moment? It's a fair question, and the honest answer isn't a single event. It's an accumulation of smaller cracks in the same trust that Nixon asked the world to extend back in 1971, each one on its own forgettable, but together forming a pattern serious enough that central bankers around the world have clearly started to notice. Start with the raw numbers, because they're not subtle. Central banks have been purchasing gold at a pace not seen in generations. Russia and China among the most aggressive buyers, both nations that have, for entirely different geopolitical reasons, grown increasingly uncomfortable with how much leverage the US dollar's global dominance hands to Washington. When a country's entire economy runs on a currency, another government can, in theory, freeze, sanction, or restrict access to. That's not just an economic relationship. It's a vulnerability. Gold, sitting in your own vault, answers to no foreign government's sanctions list. But it isn't only geopolitical rivals hedging their bets. Domestically, here in the United States, several state legislatures have passed laws in recent years attempting to formally recognize gold and silver as legal tender again. A symbolic but genuinely telling gesture, roughly a century after Roosevelt severed that exact link. And at the federal level, an unusually turbulent stretch of trade policy. Tariffs imposed, reversed, and reimposed in rapid succession, rattled markets enough that even ordinary investors, not just central banks, started asking an uncomfortable question. If the people setting monetary and trade policy seem unpredictable, how much should any of us trust the paper promise underneath our entire financial system? That unease has only deepened as political pressure on the Federal Reserve itself has intensified, with public criticism aimed directly at the institution's independence. The same institution, worth remembering, that was originally created in 1913, specifically to be insulated from short-term political pressure. When the referee of the entire monetary system starts to look politically contested, gold's appeal as something that answers to no single government at all becomes considerably easier to understand. Which brings this story to something genuinely new, a modern twist nobody in 1944 or 1971 could have anticipated. Because gold isn't the only asset benefiting from this resurgence of doubt. A growing number of investors, particularly younger ones with no emotional attachment to gold's 5,000-year history, have started treating an entirely different kind of scarce asset, the same way older generations have always treated gold, as a hedge, a store of value outside government control, something people are already beginning to nickname digital gold. Here's what stays with me about this story, long after the vaults and the treaties fade into the background. We started this video standing in front of an imaginary cube, every ounce of gold ever mined, compressed into a single physical object smaller than most people expect. And in a strange way, that cube is the most honest thing in this entire story. It's finite. It's real. You can touch it, weigh it, watch it catch the light exactly the way it caught the light for a river forager tens of thousands of years ago. Everything else we've talked about since then, the paper notes, the Federal Reserve, Bretton Woods, the dollar itself, none of it is like that cube. All of it is agreement. All of it is a shared story large enough that entire civilizations have agreed to organize their lives around it, so completely that most of us never even notice we're inside a belief system every time we glance at a price tag. That's not a flaw in the system. It might be the most remarkable thing human beings have ever built together, a functioning global economy resting on nothing but mutual trust, reinforced daily by billions of people who've never met, all quietly agreeing to keep believing at the same time. But every belief system, no matter how old or how successful, occasionally gets tested. And when enough people start to wonder, even quietly, even just at the level of a central bank's purchasing desk, whether the promise still holds, history shows us exactly where they turn first. Not to something new, to the oldest promise there is. A metal that doesn't rust, doesn't argue, doesn't answer to any government, and has never once, in 5,000 years of human history, needed anyone's permission to mean something. Maybe that's the real lesson sitting underneath all of it. Not that gold is magic, and not that paper money is a mistake. Just that trust, once you really look at it, was never really about economics at all. It was always about people agreeing, quietly and constantly, to believe in the same story together. And every so often, when that story starts to feel a little less certain, we go looking for the version of it that stood the test of the longest time. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe and share it with 5 people who'd actually sit through something like this. Leave a comment. Tell me honestly what you thought, and tell me what you want to understand next. Somewhere out there, another old story is quietly becoming relevant again, and most of the world hasn't noticed yet.